Hello, and welcome to That's Enough Out of You, the podcast. I am your host, and my name is Bill Rader, and my co-host joining me is Sean Kane. Sean, how's it going today?
Billy Ray's my main man. How's it going in the big section of town, buddy?
The big section, we're
a couple blocks up from me.
Couple of blocks up. Yeah, don't make it sound like I'm, in a gated community or anything like that.
You're on top of the hill, buddy.
Top of the hill. That's right. That just means I got further to fall.
Like Tony Soprano up there.
Right. With and I do, I barrel down the driveway in my white robe to get the paper.
Well, we got a good one tonight, buddy.
Yeah, we sure do. David Talbot, the author, is joining us to talk about Alan Dulles. And Sean, this is another one of your gets. You're with a little bit of help from Lisa.
Well,
P.
A lot of help from Lisa P. She's like our booking director, Billy. I mean, she's great. But yeah, he wrote tremendous books. Brothers is one on the Kennedy, John and Bobby Kennedy, and the other one, The Devil's Chessboard, which is on Alan Dulles, and that's the one we're going to focus in this interview tonight, because we talk about Dulles so much on our shows. But this show is going to be completely focused really on Dulles, and his book is just tremendous on that, buddy. I think it's the best book on Alan Dulles.
Yeah, and this interview was great. He just gave us so much good information about Dulles and a lot of background on Dulles, and just so many of the things that he was involved in that I mean you'd never even think about, right? But just amazing stuff.
Yeah, and this is a big interview, Bill, because he's a great author and he's connected in Hollywood, and this is a big get, buddy, for us to get him on here. And we thank Lisa for reaching out and having him come on to join us.
Yeah, I mean this is a huge get for us. We've been spoiled, Sean. I think the guests that we've been able to get so early on in this podcast. It's just incredible stuff. But yeah,
so I want to come back, Bill. That's the great thing about it.
I know, and we're going to have them back. I can't wait to get some of these guests back, and hopefully David will come back as well. This was a fantastic interview, as you guys will hear in just a moment, and we're really proud. We're really proud of the guests that we're getting and the conversations that we're having with them. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get to it. David Talbot.
Okay, welcome to That's Enough Out of You podcast. Tonight we have a special guest. The great author, David Talbot from California. How you doing, Dave?
Hey, good to be here.
Thanks for doing this, Dave. We really appreciate it. And I have to say, your books are phenomenal. The Brothers on JFK and RFK is just great. But tonight I want to focus on your book, The Devil's Chessboard, which is on a character that we discuss quite a bit on our shows, and that's Alan Dulles, because I think it's the best account of Alan Dulles that I've ever read. And I want to, if you could, before we even get into some details on Dulles, if you could set us up with a story that you had in your book, which I think is phenomenal and sets the table, from World War I, about Dulles had this affair with this young Czech woman, and then he's given information by the British. And if you could tell that story, because I think it sets the table well.
Yeah, essentially, people in power in America forever, and this goes back to World War I, as you say, are psychopaths. They do not value human life, and they get ahead as people in power because to them, humans are pawns to be used. So yes, I recount the story that Alan Dulles, as a young diplomat, during World War I in Switzerland, was informed that the woman he was seeing, was a spy for the enemy. And the British authorities then had her handed over to them by Alan Dulles. He took her for a stroll in Switzerland one evening, a date, supposedly, and he handed her instead over to the British authorities, and she was never seen again. This is the way that Alan Dulles operated throughout his career. In some ways, He was the most important, I think, figure in American power from
I agree.
1930s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s.
So, David, we've talked about Alan Dulles quite a bit on our show. I mean, we bring him up, almost every episode, especially when we're talking about, Kennedy and any topics really related to Kennedy. And we of course have mentioned that he's responsible for all of these assassinations overseas and speculation and well, I mean, hard to deny that he had involvement with JFK's assassination, if not, coordinated the whole thing. And just, numerous coups and just things all over the world. How did he amass that much power over his career and his life?
Good question. Look, Alan Dulles was not a rogue. He was not someone acting out these dark impulses on his own. He was always a fixer, someone who worked for people who had more wealth and power than he did. He was actually lived fairly simply himself. He was not a super wealthy man like his brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State under Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. Dulles was more interested in power. So he began at Sullivan Cromwell, which is the largest law firm in the country in many ways, the most powerful firm on Wall Street. His brother ran the firm. He did the dark work for the clients, for the firm, involving black bag jobs, that kind of thing. It led naturally to his work for the CIA. So Dulles was performing for the Rockefeller brothers, for the DuPonts, for the oil industry, people who are much more wealthy and powerful than he was. So I think Dulles would not have acted as he did, and you brought this up, as director of the CIA, who was deposed by President Kennedy after the disastrous invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. He would not have acted against the president if he didn't feel this powerful circle of men, and they were all men in those days, pretty much. The Council of Foreign Relations, the club in New York City, people who were his former law clients, unless they really endorsed what he was doing. He was not a rogue. He was acting in concert with people much more wealthy and powerful than he was.
And Dave, can you go back a little bit before his days at the CIA and talk a little bit about his career in the OSS and then his connection to somebody you named the Rockefeller family, David Rockefeller? He was really close to that family. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, again, the law firm that he and his brother operated on Wall Street, Sullivan and Cromwell, had Nazi clients during the 1930s, big German factories and wealthy men and so forth. And John Foster Dulles, his brother, wanted to keep those clients on board, not only during the run-up to the war, but during the war itself. I think the Dulles brothers would have been put on trial, a banker's trial like Nuremberg, for collaborating with the enemy if President Roosevelt had lived. But he died, of course, tragically in April 1945 as the war was being wound down. So yes, his spy career begins at the OSS during World War II. President Roosevelt sends him to Switzerland. He's actually the most important spy, Alan Dulles, in continental Europe during those years. I believe that Roosevelt, who was politically his enemy, of course, the Dulles brothers were Republicans, hated the New Deal, advised their clients to sabotage the New Deal, to not go along with the laws regulating Wall Street and so on. So he knew what Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles were, FDR. And I think Dulles was sent by FDR, though, to Switzerland almost as a dangle. He wanted to see the German officials, the Nazi officials who came his way in Switzerland, which was, of course, a neutral country during World War II. And that's exactly what happened. Dulles collaborated with the enemy, with people who were sent his way by Himmler, who was high up, of course, in the Third Reich, and others who slipped across the border. I think Dulles was there in part, large part, to collaborate with the Germans and make sure that there was not a left-wing communist takeover of Germany and other countries after the war.
And David, wasn't David Rockefeller over in Switzerland too, working for Army intelligence? Or was that later?
Yes, he did have an intelligence role, and Nelson, his brother, in Latin America during the war. I think that the Rockefeller brothers and the Dulles brothers were very close. And of course, Nelson Rockefeller was going to challenge, I think, President Kennedy in '64. Barry Goldwater beat him, of course, for the Republican nomination in '64, but Nelson has thrown his hat in the ring. So I think that the Rockefeller brothers have to be examined as financiers, possible financiers of the plot against President Kennedy.
And wasn't John Foster Dulles, wasn't he married into the Rockefeller family?
No, his wife was not connected directly, but I think they collaborate in many ways, the Dulles brothers and the Rockefeller brothers. Their interests were very linked.
Sure, and you see that all over. You'll see that in the Congo and Indonesia.
Cuba, Latin America, where the Rockefellers had many interests, the Standard oil companies. The Rockefellers owned real estate and supermarkets, even in Latin America. So, when Castro started to nationalize some of these industries that were owned by the Rockefellers, they had a stake in that game, and they wanted Castro removed from power.
Let's talk about an interesting name, a mistress of Allen Dulles, Mary Bancroft, and talk about her ties to someone who would be friends with Lee Harvey Oswald, Ruth Paine.
Exactly. I interviewed Ruth Paine. I interviewed her husband, Michael Paine, before he died, for my book, The Devil's Chessboard. And my conclusion about Ruth Paine was she was a witting accomplice of the conspiracy against President Kennedy, that in some ways she was witting. She was in over her head, but her father and her sister had intelligence connections. She's not a dummy. She's a very stubborn, very, in some ways, willfully stupid or ignorant woman. The husband, Michael Paine, was more of a mooncalf. I think he was a naive guy who got drawn into this world. Dulles was very good at using innocent people like the Paines in his plots. He did the same to a family called the Field family. They were Quakers during World War II. He fed Noah Field, he knew him as a boy, to Stalin behind the Iron Curtain. We could go into that. I examine his role in that plot as well. It was an attempt to bring down Stalin and his regime, and he used this innocent guy, this Quaker, as part of his plot. The same thing happened, I believe, in Texas. He was aware of the Paines. He was aware of Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was in over his head, as his wife, his Russian wife, Maria, said. He was trying to play with the big boys, and obviously he was brought down, killed, Oswald. The Paines were used to smear Oswald. Ruth Paine knew Maria, was close to them, and helped frame him in the eyes of the Warren Commission and the nation. Michael, I believe, was, as I said, an innocent who was being used, manipulated by Dulles. He was aware of the Paines through Mary Bancroft, as they say, Dulles' mistress. He became involved with her in Switzerland during World War II, Mary Bancroft. And she was kind of a strange case. She was a liberal Democrat herself, but was beguiled by Dulles' power, his daring do, supposedly, during World War II. And she became his not only collaborator as an espionage agent in Switzerland during the war, but as a lover as well. And they stayed close throughout his life. And by the way, she also became close to Dulles' wife, Clover Dulles. It was a strange kind of situation. Clover and she at one point both went to the great Carl Jung, who, apart from Freud, is probably the most well-known person in the history of psychoanalysis. And they both were patients of his. Clover Dulles came to see her husband late in the war in Switzerland. Clover figured out they were having an affair. And rather than freak out over it, the two women became very close, actually. And they both referred in letters to Allen Dulles as, quote, the shark. And they knew that he was a ruthless character. But they were very attracted for some reason to him.
That is odd. Hey, David, I've got a question, and I hate to jump around in history like this, but I want to go back to pre-World War II, actually, when Dulles was in Germany, because I had read that he actually didn't agree with what was going on in Nazi Germany, that he closed the Sullivan Cromwell office that was in Berlin, and that I also read that he had helped some Jews escape from Germany.
That's correct. He actually, I think, look, the firm was under increasing political pressure to sever its ties with the Nazi regime. Mm-hmm. And it was his older brother who ran Sullivan Cromwell, John Foster Dulles, who held out the longest. He believed that was in the interest of the firm to stay as close to these clients, Nazi clients, as possible. So he was actually the stubborn one, the one who held out the longest.
Okay.
Even though the firm in Berlin, the firm that worked for Sullivan Cromwell, was having to sign Heil Hitler at the end of their business documents and so forth. Mm-hmm. I think Allen realized this was not a good idea, and he wanted to cut them loose before his brother did. I think for political reasons, not for moral ones. Yeah. I think that both brothers were kind of enamored of that kind of power that Hitler had and Mussolini in Italy. And certainly it served their commercial interests because, as I say, Sullivan Cromwell represent these firms that were under the control of the Nazi regime. Even though they are later guilty of, collaborating and even making some of the poison gas that was used against the Jews in the death camps.
Oh, wow.
And of course, later on, Dulles would actually help in bringing some of these Nazis over.
That's right.
With Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, well, he was a very important player in salvaging the careers of these Nazi officials. Reinhard Gehlen, who became the top spy in West Germany after the war, was Hitler's chief of intelligence on the bloody Eastern Front. And he should have been hung in Nuremberg, frankly. But Dulles got him off the scrap heap and revived his career and made him the top spy in West Germany after the war. It was only because Allen Dulles sponsored him that Reinhard Gehlen escaped the hangman's noose.
David, before we get to Kennedy and the assassination, one of the fascinating things about chapter in your book was what you had on Senator Joe McCarthy in the Red Scare, and of course he has a clash and a feud with Allen Dulles. Could you explain a little bit of what happened there?
Yes, again, I think it shows Allen Dulles's cunning and his power in Washington. While his brother was running the State Department under President Eisenhower in the 50s, he quickly caved to this hysteria brought into Washington by Joe McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin. And he actually cleansed the State Department of everyone suspected of any kind of liberal or New Deal or kind of communist, apparently, allegedly tie. So John Foster Dulles quickly caved to Joe McCarthy. Allen Dulles was a different animal. He was running the CIA then. And McCarthy came after the CIA too. He'd already been quite successful at the State Department. He had his own guy installed there to politically implement the Inquisition. But Allen Dulles said, you're not going to do this at the State Department. And he came after Joe McCarthy, came after William Bundy, among others. William Bundy was a liberal who had defended Alger Hiss, who was suspected of being a communist traitor, and so on. He'd done sort of pro forma, democratic liberal things. And Joe McCarthy wanted him removed, wanted him to become his next victim. And Allen Dulles hid Bill Bundy and protected his career. Bill Bundy later served in the State Department under President Kennedy. So the Bundy family, which is a very powerful family, his brother,
right, McGeorge,
was a national security advisor to the president. I believe that the Bundys were agents or very close to the Dulles family. And so to have National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy serve under President Kennedy is kind of creepy because he was very loyal to Allen Dulles, who's Kennedy's enemy. So yes, he stands up to Joe McCarthy and says, you are not going to, go after the CIA. The CIA is off your, radar. I'm sorry, you're not going to touch it. It produced a big controversy at the time in Washington. It played out in the press. McCarthy wanted to drag the CIA officials before his committee to be interrogated, and Allen Dulles would just not cooperate. He was a hero as a result to the rank and file at the CIA because he stood up to McCarthy. And he's now known for having been brought down, Joe McCarthy, during the Army McCarthy hearings by the U.S. military. But I think the first blood that was drawn against McCarthy was by Allen Dulles at the CIA.
And that's really amazing because McCarthy brought so much fear into people, and Dulles goes after him and just kind of squashes him like a grape.
That's right. It showed who had the real power, I think, in Washington.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, Dave, let's get now. JFK comes into office, and the first thing he has to deal with is the Bay of Pigs, and eventually that would lead to him getting rid of Dulles. And how you describe in your book, after Dulles gets fired, he really kind of goes back to Georgetown, and he creates a government in exile, is what you called it. And if you could describe a little bit of Bay of Pigs and how Dulles lied and deceived Kennedy on that.
Well, I think the traitorous behavior, the treasonous behavior, actually becomes before the Bay of Pigs, which occurs early on, April 1961. It occurred even weeks, days after Kennedy is sworn in as president, when the CIA had Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, kidnapped by his political enemies, tortured and killed. I think he was executed, Patrice Lumumba, by the CIA, by agents of the CIA. And Kennedy was not informed of this. Kennedy regarded Patrice Lumumba as one of the heroes of third world nationalism. He was pinning his hopes on this neither communist, neither Western, sort of independent third force in the third world to come to power. And Patrice Lumumba was a very charismatic young leader, the first democratically elected president of Congo after the long, brutal rule of the Belgian colonialists. So when he's killed, and that is hidden from him by Allen Dulles and the CIA, that's the first betrayal, really, of Kennedy. And it was Adlai Stevenson, who was Kennedy's representative at the UN, who finally informed Kennedy. And there's a famous picture taken of Kennedy in the White House where his face is crumpled, he's holding his head, he's an egg, and hearing this terrible news that Patrice Lumumba has been executed in Congo. So that's the first, as I say, real betrayal. And a few weeks later, months later, of course, there's the CIA invasion of Cuba. They told him it would be a slam dunk. President Kennedy had qualms about it, did not want it to be a big problem, did not want the Soviet Union to counter in Berlin, did not want it to become an international incident. Of course, the CIA's guys are bogged down on the beach right away, this ragtag army. I think they were meant to be bog down quickly. I cite the evidence why. I think that was the whole design Allen Dulles had, and Richard Bissell, his deputy, was these invaders to be bogged down and then Kennedy would be forced to send in the Marines and the Air Force to save them. But he refused to do that, Kennedy said, I will not make this a wider war. And when he stopped, I think, the Air Force from going in and the Marines, that was, I think, the first real fracture between Kennedy and the CIA, between Kennedy and Dulles. Now, I also go into, this is at the same time the CIA is doing this in Cuba. It's trying to depose an ally in France, President de Gaulle, the democratically elected president of France, through a military coup that was backed by the CIA.
Right.
He had to tell the French ambassador to Washington, I'm sorry, I'm not in control of my own government. This was happening at the same time in April of 1961. And he meant he was not in control of the CIA, that they were creating mischief everywhere around the globe. And so at the same time that they're involved, the CIA in Cuba, they're also trying to overthrow de Gaulle in France. They failed to do that, as they failed to do overthrow Castro in Cuba.
And of course, a lot of their problems with de Gaulle was because he was speaking against the French colonialism that was going on in Algeria, correct?
That's right. De Gaulle had settled a war in Algeria. He finally pulled a plug on it. And the French generals were irate, the ones who had served there. And of course, they famously tried to kill him several times. The Day of the Jackal, the movie novel, goes into one of the assassination plots against President Gaulle. So the right wing was violently opposed to de Gaulle, and the CIA was supporting them.
So after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy gets rid of Dulles, he gets rid of Bissell, he gets rid of Charles Cabell, General Charles Cabell, whose brother would actually be the mayor of Dallas, the assassination. And then you talk in your book about the government in exile that Dulles created. Could you talk a little bit about that and the people who from the CIA were still going and kind of reporting to Dulles even after he didn't have the position anymore as director?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think that's key to understanding Allen Dulles. He's gently deposed by President Kennedy. He's given a few months after the Bay of Pigs to gather his things, to get a medal from the president, and he goes out in an honorable way, by the way. By the end of the year, he's out of the CIA. And according to people who saw him, old friends and so on, he did lick his wounds for a few weeks. He was shocked that a president had actually thrown him out of office, as President Kennedy did. Even as gently and honorably as he did, he had been discharged. He'd served every president since, I believe, Woodrow Wilson, and now he was out in the cold. So he goes home, as you say, to Georgetown, and for a few weeks he's, I think, very depressed. He's disconsolate, and then I believe he formed, as I say, the government in exile against President Kennedy. James Angleton, who is the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, Richard Helms, who's the top official who really ran, I believe, the CIA, even though JFK had brought in John McCone to run the agency. John McCone was a Republican businessman from California, really was not an old boy, didn't understand the CIA culture. It was Helms and people like him and Angleton who really ran the agency and ran circles, I believe, ran McCone. And they treated Allen Dulles as if he were still the director. They called him the old man out of great affection. They came to his home in Georgetown. They reported to him. They told him everything that was going on in the agency. I believe Allen Dulles still was effectively operating as America's top spy master, even after President Kennedy fired him. That's a hell of a charge to make, by the way, in a democracy like ours.
Right. And Kennedy moved the CIA to report to and correct me if I'm wrong, David, they were supposed to be reporting to the Joint Chiefs, correct? At that point?
The CIA? No. Yes. According to law, the CIA reports to the president, to the White House. When President Truman signed the order for the CIA and brought them into existence, I believe in 1947, it was he believed that the CIA would just act as gather intelligence from the different agencies and give it to the president. So they reported directly to the president. President Truman famously said, "I do not want an American Gestapo. I don't want a spy agency that creates great mischief around the world." And that's exactly what Allen Dulles and the CIA ended up doing. So it's meant to be an intelligence gathering agency for the president.
I see. Okay.
Well, I think what Bill might be referring to, Dave, didn't Kennedy try to revamp the CIA though? And wasn't he going to take some of covert operations away from the CIA and give it to the military?
Yes, that was part of the plan. And of course, he said after the Bay of Pigs, the CIA fuck up there, "I'm going to shatter the agency and scatter it in 1,000 pieces."
Right.
And scatter to the wind.
Right.
So, yes, he was furious against the CIA. He had Arthur Schlesinger, who was an aide, the famous historian, who had served in the OSS, knew something about the culture, was a friend of Richard Helms, played tennis with him. He had Schlesinger draw up a plan to radically restructure the CIA, even rename it, because he was so angry at the CIA for their duplicitous behavior around Cuba and other ways. He didn't trust them. So, but for political reasons, he backed down. And he should have gone ahead, I think, with the restructuring of the CIA. He didn't fire enough people, frankly. You said earlier he fired Dulles, Bissell, and Cabell. That's true. He lopped the top people off, their heads off the CIA, but he didn't cut deep enough. He should have fired Angleton. He should have fired Helms. I think JFK was a political animal. He realized that he could only go so far. But for instance, de Gaulle in France, after they tried to kill him, the right wing, was ruthless. He went after those people. He killed them before they could kill him. And that's what it took to stay in power in those days. It took a civil ruthlessness. And I believe that de Gaulle was trying to tell Kennedy, look, the same people are operating in your country, and you have to be as tough as I am. And Kennedy, for political reasons, also because of his wealth, his family, his sense of entitlement, believed that he could bring the CIA to heel by not cutting deep enough. And I think that was a tragic mistake.
And Dave, a couple of unbelievable things that you point out in your book, Devil's Chessboard, which I got to say, what an appropriate title for a book on Allen Dulles. That's just a great title.
Both brothers, by the way, loved to play chess. John Foster and Ellen. They would play against each other. That's why I came up with that title. And so I believe they thought of the world as their chessboard.
Yeah.
And move pawns here, right and left. They sacrifice them according to their strategic needs and so on. And so that's where the title comes from.
That's great. I mean, but a couple of amazing things that you point out in the book. The summer of the assassination, summer '63, there was an internal CIA document that you point out where Dulles met with Army General Lucius Clay, who we know Kennedy had such difference with in the Berlin Wall crisis, and this shadow figure, Martinez, who was an anti-Castro Cuban. Could you explain a little bit about that in this meeting? Because to me, that's so fascinating, because I think it sets up what's going to come down in November.
Well, you're right. Again, this goes to how Allen Dulles operated his government in exile, his shadow government against President Kennedy after Kennedy fires him. Among the many people he meets at his home in Georgetown are Lucius Clay, as you say, the former general who was, adamantly opposed and nearly started nuclear war, World War III in Berlin, when the Soviet Union put up the wall in Berlin. He wanted American tanks to knock it down. There was nearly an exchange between a military exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the intemperate behavior of Lucius Clay. So he's one of the right-wing guys in the military world who hates the Kennedys. Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, is another one. Edwin Walker, the famous John Bircher, extreme right-wing guy who was pushed out of the military by Kennedy. I mean, there was a hotbed of fanaticism within the Pentagon in those days. Another guy, you're right, that he meets with is Paulino Sierra Martinez. He was a thug from Cuba. During the Batista dictatorship before Castro, he was an assassin. He was a tough guy. He was a guy who was very comfortable with guns. His daughter-in-law later saw him moving guns in and out of his son's apartment in Chicago. So why is Dulles, this refined former corporate lawyer, the head of the CIA, meeting with a thug like Sierra Martinez? It's very strange. We don't know for sure why he was there that day, why he came to visit Dulles at his home in Georgetown. But these are the kind of people that Dulles was associating with that day. You know, the weekend that Kennedy is killed in Dallas, this is very important. I found the document, and a number of other researchers like Lisa Pease have found this document too, from his date book, from Allen Dulles' date book. It was at the Seeley Mudd Library in Princeton, where all Allen Dulles' papers are housed. This showed clearly that the weekend that Kennedy is killed in Dallas and Jack Ruby guns down Lee Harvey Oswald, where is Allen Dulles, a man who was fired by President Kennedy in 1961, pushed out of the CIA? He should have been retired by then. Instead, he's at the farm. He shows up at a CIA facility, Camp Peary in Northern Virginia. And this is according to his own date book. And he writes it down that he's at Camp Peary that weekend. It was a top secret CIA facility where you could monitor what is going on. So what the hell is Allen Dulles doing at Camp Peary that weekend when he's been pushed out of the CIA in 2 years before?
Right. He should have no access to it.
Here's the strange thing. That document that showed he was at Camp Peary that weekend somehow was disappeared. And the library claims it has no record of it at all, according to researchers who've looked into this. I have a copy of it. Lisa Pease has a copy.
Right.
Other researchers have copies of it. Why would they disappear this document after my book came out? Because it shows Allen Dulles was up to no good, I think, that weekend. That's why it was disappeared. That's the way Dulles operated all the time when he was alive. He would change the record to go along with his own aims, his own strategies, even if the record was contradictory or when it was contradictory. So I believe this shows that the long arm of the cover-up, whoever is behind this cover-up, the CIA killing of President Kennedy, is still operative. And they removed this document from the library at Princeton for a reason.
Unbelievable. And another amazing story that's in your book, you talk about Peter Dell Scott, and he was at Glenn Campbell, the entrepreneur. I believe it was his house. They had a dinner, and they started really hammering in on Kennedy. And could you talk a little bit about that and what happened at that dinner party?
Yeah, that was the whole genesis for my book. I'm a good friend of Peter's, and Karen Croft, who helped me with the research on the book, and I were having lunch with Peter one day in Berkeley, and he mentioned this amazing story from, I believe, 1962. He had been invited as a young professor, former diplomat, Canadian diplomat, to Poland to come to a lunch sponsored, as you say, by Campbell, hosted by Campbell, the head of the Hoover Institute at Stanford, the right-wing institute. And at this luncheon, there were a number of right-wing people, Cold Warriors, who were griping really loudly and viciously even to Peter's ears about President Kennedy, saying he was a traitor, he was a pro-communist guy, he was a weak president, what are we going to do about him, and so on and so forth. Finally, the alpha male in the room, who was a Russian Orthodox priest, held up his hand And he said, silence, gentlemen, the old man will take care of it. Well, at the time, Peter thought the old man was Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK. But I knew that Joe Kennedy by then had had a stroke and was in no position to help his sons at all anymore. He could barely speak. He mumbled only. He was in a wheelchair. The old man I knew was Allen Dulles, and that was the nickname that was used by people who have great respect for him within the CIA. And so when this priest, who seemed to know what he was talking about, said Allen Dulles will take care of it, I felt chills on the back of my neck, because I knew that Allen Dulles had played a key role in not only the assassination of the president, but as the key member of the Warren Commission, which looked into the assassination. He played a key role in the cover-up as well.
Now, Dave, do we know who exactly was at that party? Do we know, was there any Rockefellers there? Do we know, any names that were there?
Again, you would have to ask Peter. Peter didn't. I don't think anyone of that stature was there. The Rockefeller.
Okay.
It was a number of people who, hated President Kennedy for political reasons and thought he should be removed and didn't know how to. And the point was, the priest, who really had great respect in the room, stood up and said the old man was going to take care of it.
Right. And then that leads us to what E. Howard Hunt would call the big event. And you talk in your book about his confession and how he really leaves out one name and points the finger at somebody else. Could you tell that story a little bit about his confession?
Yeah, I think Hunt is a really interesting character. And of course, they make him to be a figure of great fun, a comedic figure. Woody Harrelson is playing him in the current TV series on HBO.
White House
and during Watergate. And in some ways, he was an extreme and sort of comical character. But I believe he played some role in the assassination of the president. His son, St. John Hunt, who I interviewed extensively, and was asked by his father during Watergate to help him out, get rid of incriminating evidence and so on, felt that he also played a role in the assassination, felt that he was in Dallas that day. And he kind of did what the CIA calls a limited hangout, sort of a partial confession in his own book. And he told St. John that he was dying, the senior Hunt, and also Eric Hamburg, who is former congressional aide, who was involved with the making of JFK, the movie, the Oliver Stone movie. He told both of them on tape and in writing that there was a meeting of CIA guys in Miami, the big event, as they referred to the assassination of the president. And he named several people who were involved in that plot against the president. He named, among others, William Harvey, who was head of assassinations for the CIA. And the Kennedys hated him because he sent raiding parties into Cuba that could have provoked a nuclear war. And Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, was particularly outraged. And to save his career, Dick Helms at the CIA sent Bill Harvey to head up the Rome station of the CIA in 1963. So Bill Harvey was a Kennedy hater, was an assassin, and I believe was given a job by Allen Dulles to round up the shooters who were used in Dallas that day. His own deputy, Mark Wyatt, in Rome, saw him on a plane, and the plane was going to Dallas. He said, "What the hell are you going to Dallas?" In the weeks before the assassination. He had no reason to go there. He said very strangely, I'm going there just to look around. I believe that Bill Harvey, as I said, recruited the shooters, as he had done before for the CIA in foreign missions, and was going to look at the logistics in Dallas to make sure that everything went smoothly. He got very drunk the day of the assassination back in Italy. Mark Wyatt said he said very incriminating things that implicated him, Harvey. I believe that that he was involved in the assassination of the president.
And Dave, I know it's hard to pin down who the actual shooters were, but do you think that it could have possibly been the members of the OAS that were trying to kill DeGaulle? Because one of them, the guy by the name of Sutre, was in Dallas the day of the assassination.
There is some evidence to show that there was some connection between, the secret army organization France who trying to kill President de Gaulle, as well as what was happening in the U.S. I believe de Gaulle felt that there was some overlap, some linkage between the two. I don't know for certain. I didn't do a lot of research on this. I don't think any compelling evidence to suggest who the exact shooters were, whether they were eliminated after killing the president or not. But it's quite clear from physical evidence that there were shots from the famous grassy knoll area from the front as well as from behind. And that was all the doctors who worked on the president, the mortally wounded president at Parkland Hospital, the key surgeons, people who were in the motorcade that day, heard shots from the front and the back. Kennedy was caught in a crossfire. And it was a professional operation. It was not Lee Harvey Oswald, who was not a terribly good marksman from all accounts, firing his gun and shooting the magic bullet to kill the president. I think President Kennedy was gunned down by a professional operation.
And of course, the Hunt confession, he points the blame at Lyndon Johnson as the mastermind, but the people he named, like Harvey and Morales, and I think who else they named, Cord Meyer, people like that, they had no connection to Johnson. Their connection was to Allen Dulles.
Yeah, I believe that Allen Dulles was the key figure who put together the operation. And I think he was very proud of it. Again, he reported to people who were much wealthier than him, much more powerful. He was not a rogue, Allen Dulles. He was not doing this on his own. He was doing because he checked in with people like the Rockefeller brothers, others. The guy who was head of the Secret Service, Doug Dillon, was a Republican, a close friend of Dulles, and got kid glove treatment during the Warren Commission hearing. So he's someone I would want to grill too. He was from a wealthy family, Wall Street family, had a lot of money, a lot of power. What the hell was the Secret Service performed terribly that day in Dallas, and this guy was head of it, Doug Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury. So yes, I think you have to look at Dillon. I think you look at the Rockefeller brothers who hated the Kennedys, who were very close to the Dulles brothers and so on as accomplices. But Dulles was given the job. Who gave him the job? Who gave him the green light? We don't know to this day. But this is the way that Dulles operated. That wealthier men, more powerful men gave him the green light, and then he put together the operation. That's what I say in the Devil's Chessboard. He's the key figure in putting together the operation and the cover-up, because he served on the Warren Commission. And some people say the Warren Commission should have been called the Dulles Commission, because Earl Warren, as Chief Justice, had a day job. He was very busy. He was, head of the Supreme Court. Allen Dulles was supposedly retired in those days. He had a lot of time on his hands, and he put it into the Warren Commission.
And of course, Dillon, he was out of the country conveniently, right, when the assassination went down.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and as I said, as head of the Secret Service, he had a lot to answer for, but the Warren Commission made sure that he was treated very gently. In fact, the Warren Commission said, what more do you need in terms of budget for the Secret Service? It helped him, if anything, instead of being grilled. Dulles himself should have been grilled, frankly, and he was only one time, as I say in the book, Devil's Chessboard, asked tough questions by a grad student at UCLA. He went there 2 or 3 years after the assassination, and David Lifton was the grad student in physics. He happened, because he was a nerd, he had read all the volumes of the Warren Report, and he couldn't believe this. And he'd seen the photographic evidence what happened in Dealey Plaza. So he asked Allen Dulles at a seminar some tough questions at UCLA, and Allen Dulles tried to joke it away and shut him up, but all the students were curious, wanted to hear what Allen Dulles had to say. He got very uptight, very angry, he dissembled, And I think if you put Allen Dulles on a witness stand, he would have folded quickly under a professional grilling.
I think just the fact, David, that he was on the Warren Commission, a guy who was a clear political enemy of Kennedy, that tells you everything you need to know right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the guy who is a political enemy. He's been fired by President Kennedy, and he claimed later that Bobby Kennedy intervened with President Johnson to get him on the commission. This is hogwash. President Johnson, for one thing, hated Bobby Kennedy, famously hated him, and there's no way that he would have listened to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy would not have intervened with President Johnson on behalf of Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles got that job because people who were very close to the president, very powerful, went to him and said, "You're going to put this guy on the commission." That's why Allen Dulles ended up there,
right?
Because of Bobby Kennedy.
And it's really amazing, David, the indirect or even sometimes direct connections that Oswald has to Allen Dulles, you know, through people like George de Mohrenschildt and the Paynes, who we talked about earlier. You know, and you talk in your book about the famous quote by the senator, "The fingerprints of intelligence are all over Oswald." Can you talk a little bit about that, about, you know, Oswald?
Yeah, look, Oswald is what, 23-year-old kid? He's a kid. He's young. I have sons who are like, you know, older than him, who's still immature. He was, as his wife, Russian wife Maria said, he was playing with the big boys. He was in over his head. He was a low-level intelligence agent. There's no way that you're inserted in the Soviet Union. You denounce your citizenship. You say you're going to share top secrets with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, and you come back with the State Department alone, and you're not molested by the FBI, you're not thrown in a dungeon, it's a jail somewhere like they did during the War on Terror. Did anyone seen collaborating with the Taliban or, you know, so on? No, this didn't happen. He was in the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey Oswald, former Marine, sent to study Russian by the Marines, because he was a low-level agent. He was part of the program, probably run by James Angleton and the CIA, to insert false defectors into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union smelt him out right away, and they sent him as far from Moscow as they could. He worked in a radio factory in the boonies in Russia. And he was a terrible marksman, by the way. People who knew him when they went out shooting on the weekends, rabbits to eat, said he was a terrible marksman. So this was the guy who supposedly was the expert sharpshooter in the Texas Book Depository. It's laughable. Using, by the way, an old World War II gun that was faulty. And supposedly he got off these expert shots in Dallas. So he was an espionage agent. He was brought home with a Russian wife, not thrown in jail, as I say. And you're right, that this very older, sophisticated guy, a white Russian named George de Mohrenschildt, becomes his good friend. Well, he was a CIA babysitter. He was babysitting him for the CIA, George de Mohrenschildt. He was an international smooth guy who worked for the oil industry. He went overseas like Clay Shaw in New Orleans. He did things that were very, you know, that were useful to the CIA. He was an asset for the CIA.
And a longtime connection to Allen Dulles.
Exactly. And Allen Dulles knew about him, knew about his brother, who was a right-wing professor, and so on. So their politics were in line with each other. Now, I believe that George de Mohrenschildt later on, after the assassination, after Oswald is killed himself, felt guilt about having befriended Oswald, about having helped set him up with the Warren Commission, his testimony. And he later writes a book called I Am a Patsy. That's what Oswald famously shouted out to the press when he was held after the assassination. And by the way, that's weird too. Most assassins are proud of it. They have shot the president. You know, Sic Semper Tyrannis, John Wilkes Booth shouted out after he shot Lincoln. Thus always to tyrants. So Oswald does not claim credit proudly for killing the president. He says, I was set up. I'm a patsy. And then he's killed. He's silenced forever. So I believe George de Marnschell was a smart guy, and he figured out that he was being used by the CIA to help set up Oswald. And he later writes a book called I Am a Patsy. I read that book. It hasn't been published. It's online. It's available. You can read it. It's basically a mea culpa. It says this kid was in way over his head. I helped set him up. I feel bad about it. He later appeals to George Bush, the senior Bush, when he's head of the CIA, says, look, I feel my phones are tapped. I'm being, harassed by, I think the CIA. And he's found, they believe, it was ruled as suicide. He's killed. There's a number of people who were conveniently eliminated who began to talk. George de Marnschell was one of them. Whether it was a suicide or not, whether he was murdered and silenced, like Lee Harvey Oswald, we don't know to this day.
Yeah, so Dave, this has been great. I know we took up a lot of your time here. I just got a couple more questions, because I think there's one more thing in your book that I think we need to cover. You had a chapter there in talking about the CIA and what they did in Italy, in Rome, Italy. Really, James Angleton was heavily involved in this anti-left-wing strategy, kind of trying to put a fascist back into power, basically. Could you talk a little bit about that, about what the CIA was doing in Rome and in Italy specifically?
Yeah, well, that was part of the CIA operation. Of course, they were deathly afraid that the communists would take power there, electoral power, after the war. So Angleton, who spoke Italian pretty well, was based in Italy. He and his father had been Italian and been U.S. espionage agents during the war. Made sure that the right amounts of money were delivered to voters, to the Christian Democrats. And basically, the CIA, through their use of money and other leverage, were able to sway the election to the Christian Democrats away from the communists in 1948, I believe. And so this is one example of a bloodless coup, basically, because the CIA affected the course of events without killing people. They were prepared to do that as well. In Italy, when President Kennedy visited in 1963, Harvey, as I said earlier, Bill Harvey was head of the CIA station then. And there were a number of false flag terrorist incidents, bombings of offices blamed on the left. Kennedy wanted to open up Italy. It was called the opening to the left. He wanted the socialists to serve in the government for the first time. And he actually told the head of the Socialist Party during his visit to Rome in summer of 1963 that I'm going to support this position. I want the left to be involved in a coalition government in Italy. I believe the CIA was very opposed to this, and they were using this wave of false flag terrorism to disrupt this coalition. And of course, after President Kennedy is assassinated, it doesn't happen.
Right. I mean, that to me was just an amazing chapter in your book about what they did there. But my final question, Dave, and after I read your book, Devil's Chessboard, a long time ago, I mean, there was no doubt in my mind that Dulles was the mastermind. I mean, I think you perfectly made that clear. But do you believe that the structure that Dulles created all these years ago, kind of like whatever you want to call it, the deep state, aligning himself with the corporate world, and the regime change and the assassination unit that he created, and kind of this invisible government, do you think that it still exists today, just different names?
Absolutely. And we're talking about how they disappeared this document showing Dulles was at a CIA facility. And that was within the last couple of years, the weekend of the assassination. So I do believe, actually, I posted about this today on Facebook. It's a strange, I'm a lefty. I'm on the left wing of the Democratic Party. I have been my whole life. But it's a strange state of affairs that Trump and people like Tucker Carlson, who was just fired by Fox News, have become against war. The peace is speaking for peace. There was no war when Trump was president. The neocons have entered the Democratic Party and taken over. The people have been should have been shamed into silence forever by their support, their advocacy of the disastrous war in Iraq. these people have found a home, strangely, in the Democratic Party. And partly because of them, that lobby, which Ben Rhodes from the Obama White House called the blob, the national security people in think tanks, we've been at war my whole life. The US has been at war somewhere around the globe my whole entire life. I'm 71. So President Kennedy was trying to stop this madness. He was trying to say, look, our ideas, our democracy is the way that we sway opinion around the world. That's why so many boulevards, statues, to this day, you still see President Kennedy around the world, because he was regarded with great admiration and respect by people around the world. Instead, the US has done exactly what President Kennedy had. It spoke against, which is to try and win the world through war constantly. While we're busy blowing up things, the Chinese are trying to build things and win the respect of the rest of the world that way. I believe that America has to go back to what President Kennedy said, that we all breathe the same air, that we all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal. And that's what I believe has to be the spirit of American foreign policy and democracy today.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dave. Thank you very much. This was outstanding.
Yeah.
Billy, you got anything else?
Yeah, no, just amazing words from President Kennedy.
Yeah.
And
American University in June '63.
Yep.
Speaking about our enemies, the Russians, he said, we all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal. Amazing empathy for the people of supposedly a mortal enemy.
Right. Amazing.
Yeah. And just, such a visionary, and we've never seen anything like him since. And I don't know if we ever will.
No, I regret that. Because I have sons, as I said, who are both, one in their late 20s, one 30. They're doing their best thing. Joe, my oldest son, made the movie The Last Black Man in San Francisco. So he's trying to speak for harmony, for sanity in the world. I think your generation's doing what you can. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. And you have a strong connection to Hollywood, David, right? Your father actually, I was reading this, your father was one of the founding members of the Screen Actors Guild. That's fascinating.
Yeah, we have a strike now in Hollywood. It's the Writers Guild is striking. So those unions have a strong, really proud history in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And my father, I'm very proud of this, was one of the founders of the Screen Actors Guild. And I think it hurt him, his career politically, because he was so a proponent of the union. He was a contract player at Warner Brothers in the 1930s. And I believe that's one reason that he was dropped at Warner's. But he had a pretty successful career as an actor. And he went on to do a lot of TV when I was growing up, and theater.
And he was on, was it Ozzie and Harriet? Is that the sitcom that he was on?
My brother was on Leave It to Beaver, which is
wow.
another iconic.
Amazing.
Yeah.
My brother played Gilbert, who was always getting the beaver into trouble.
Right.
And my dad was regular, was the friend of Ozzie on Ozzie and Harriet. Yeah.
That's amazing. Oh, that's great stuff.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
Well, David, we couldn't thank you enough for taking the time, to answer our questions and speak with us. We really appreciate it. We hope we can get you back on one of these days.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thank you so much, David.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. What a fantastic interview. He just so much information, Sean, and he wasn't reading from notes or anything. He just knows this stuff.
Amazing, Billy. Amazing interview. And like I said during the interview, when I got done reading his book, and I read his book, shortly after it came out, there was no doubt in my mind who the mastermind of the Kennedy assassination was after reading that book. Yeah. And I think, after this episode, if any of our listeners still have any doubts of who masterminded this, I don't know what else we could tell you.
Well, and again, as I said during the interview, the fact that he was on the Warren Commission, a guy who was a clear political enemy of JFK, and he's on the commission investigating his assassination.
Right. And a guy whose greatest asset, Bill, is keeping secrets.
Right. Exactly. And you put him on a truth commission.
I
mean, imagine OJ on his own jury.
Right.
It's the kind of the same thing. It's a guy who orchestrated this assassination and part of the cover up. And now they're saying, well, why don't you investigate it? Oh, okay.
And the great thing, Bill, when he mentioned about, how Dulles was at the farm and that, Dulles was so arrogant, he put that in his own day calendar and it was in Princeton.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it disappeared, and people seen this. He has a copy, Lisa Pease has a copy and but still, I mean, it goes to show you, Bill, the cover up's still going on to this day, buddy.
And, you wonder, Sean, I mean, could it happen today? I mean, in those days, and we've talked about this before, but, in those days, and the public was a little bit more accepting and more trusting of the government, what they were being told. And, when they didn't really question Lee Harvey Oswald, nobody went into this guy's background. Nobody dug into,
right.
Who this guy was and why. And we're being told he killed the president. Okay, why? Who is he? Where did he come from? What has he been doing the last 5 years? Nobody really got into that.
No.
And you would think if they did, and certainly they would today, I mean, we get into the background of anybody who breaks into a drugstore, a convenience store.
Well, to answer your question, Bill, I think it definitely could happen today, but I think it would be totally different way they would go about it.
Yeah.
Today, I think character assassination is used more.
I think you're right.
An actual assassination, in today's age of social media, you could totally ruin somebody easily.
Right.
Without ever having to kill them.
Absolutely. You're right.
Take them right out of the picture. They're just assassinating their character.
Yeah. Anyway, Sean, this was fantastic. It was a great interview. Thank you to Lisa. Thank you to David Talbot for coming on, and hope you can come back and join us again. And thank you guys.
Definitely.
Thanks to our listeners. Hope you guys enjoyed this one.
We'd like to get him back to next time, talk about the book Brothers, on JFK and RFK. That would be great.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. Yeah. All right, Sean, good job. I mean, you did most of the interview, so congrats.
Well, I'm a big fan of the book, Billy, and I just, I know the book really by heart. I read it so many times. I mean, it's just, to me, it's a fascinating book, and just to end it, that's enough out of you, Dulles. We heard enough.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.